Most people think the most painful betrayals in life happen in courtrooms, boardrooms, or business deals. But in my 78 years of life, I've learned something far more uncomfortable. The moments that truly test a person's dignity almost always happen inside their own family, in places where respect is supposed to come naturally. Weddings are a perfect example of that. People imagine weddings as beautiful celebrations where two families come together, smiling for photos and pretending everything is perfect. But what most people never admit is that weddings are also where families quietly measure each other, where money, reputation, and pride start whispering behind polite smiles. And sometimes, if you're unlucky enough, a wedding can become the stage where someone decides to publicly remind you exactly where they think you belong. That's exactly what happened to me on the night my son got married. The ballroom was beautiful, crystal chandeliers, polished marble floors, the kind of place that looks like it belongs in a magazine about expensive weddings. My son looked happy, the guests were laughing, and for a moment I thought the evening would pass exactly the way every parent hopes it will, peacefully, proudly, without drama. But then my daughter-in-law decided to introduce me to her family. Now introductions at weddings are usually simple, polite, maybe a little awkward. But the moment she raised her glass and looked in my direction, I saw something in her expression that made me pause. It was the kind of smile people wear when they believe they're about to say something very clever, something they expect everyone else in the room to laugh at. And a few seconds later the entire ballroom did laugh. Because instead of introducing me as the father of the groom, instead of mentioning the man who raised the son she had just married, my daughter-in-law pointed directly at me in front of hundreds of guests and said something that instantly turned me into the evening's entertainment. Within seconds the laughter spread across her side of the family. Cousins whispering to each other. Friends covering their mouths while they laughed. Even a few people at nearby tables started turning their heads to see what the joke was about. And for a brief moment, I could feel every eye in the room quietly judging the old man standing there in a simple gray suit. Now, most people in that situation would probably feel embarrassed, maybe even angry enough to leave. And I'll admit the thought crossed my mind. Because when your own daughter-in-law decides to humiliate you in front of an entire wedding reception, dignity becomes a very fragile thing. But the interesting part of this story isn't the insult itself. People say foolish things at weddings all the time. No, the interesting part is what happened next. Because while everyone else in that ballroom believed they were laughing at an old man who didn't belong in their world, none of them realized something very important about me yet. My name is Arthur Whitmore. I'm 78 years old, and I've spent most of my life sitting in rooms where people eventually regret the things they say too confidently. And that night, my daughter-in-law was about to learn a lesson about respect that no wedding guest would ever forget. The interesting thing about arrogance is that it usually grows louder when people believe they're surrounded by an audience that agrees with them. When my daughter-in-law finished her little introduction and the laughter spread across her side of the ballroom, she looked genuinely pleased with herself. The way people look when they think they've just delivered the cleverest joke of the evening. A few of her cousins leaned toward each other whispering something I couldn't quite hear, but judging by the way they kept glancing back at me, I didn't need to hear it to understand the message. They had already decided what kind of man I must be. And that's the funny thing about strangers at weddings, they build entire stories about you within seconds. They look at your suit, your posture, the way you carry yourself, and suddenly they believe they understand your entire life. One of the bride's uncles, a tall man with a voice loud enough to make sure half the table could hear him, leaned back in his chair and asked me what I used to do before retirement. Now the tone he used was familiar to me. I had heard it many times over the years, that polite curiosity people show when they're already convinced the answer will confirm their assumptions. Before I could even respond, my daughter-in-law jumped in quickly, waving her hand dismissively as if answering for me. She said something about how I had always been a very quiet man who preferred simple things, and while that might sound harmless at first, the way she said it carried a different meaning entirely. The relatives around her nodded knowingly, as if that explanation confirmed exactly what they had already decided about me. In their minds, I was the humble, slightly embarrassing background character in their daughter's otherwise impressive wedding story. Someone who should probably stay quiet, smile politely, and not interrupt the atmosphere they were enjoying. And I could see the confidence growing on their faces as they continued talking. Conversations started drifting toward subjects that people with money often enjoy discussing when they want to establish status. Vacation homes in Europe, private school tuition, investment portfolios, exclusive golf clubs. Every few minutes someone would casually drop a comment about their business connections or the size of their company, as if those details were meant to remind the rest of the table who belonged in their social circle and who didn't. My daughter-in-law seemed particularly proud of that atmosphere. She kept introducing different relatives with impressive titles attached to their names. A cousin who worked in finance, an uncle who owned several properties, a family friend who apparently sat on the board of some large company. Each introduction came with a subtle glance in my direction, as if she was quietly reinforcing the contrast she wanted everyone to notice. Meanwhile, my son sat beside her looking increasingly uncomfortable, the kind of uncomfortable that only happens when someone realizes a situation is becoming cruel but doesn't yet know how to stop it without causing a scene. I could see him shifting in his chair, occasionally opening his mouth as if he wanted to say something, only to close it again when another relative started talking over the moment. And that, in many ways, was the most revealing part of the entire situation. Because arrogance doesn't always show itself through shouting or insults. Sometimes it appears in the quiet confidence that no one will challenge you. My daughter-in-law clearly believed that confidence was justified. She picked up her glass again and looked around the table, smiling as if she had another story to share. "You know," she said, leaning slightly toward her relatives, "when I first met my husband's family, I was a little worried about what the wedding might look like." The comment drew a few curious looks, and she continued speaking before anyone else could interrupt. "But luckily my parents helped us make it presentable." A few people laughed again, softer this time but still amused enough to encourage her. The implication was obvious, that without her family's influence and money, the event would have been something far less elegant. And while many guests in the room probably assumed she was exaggerating for humor, the truth was quite different. What none of them knew was that I had spent nearly a year quietly helping my son arrange this wedding, making sure he had the resources to give his bride exactly the celebration she wanted. But I didn't interrupt her. I simply listened, the way I had listened to thousands of arguments during my career, letting the story unfold naturally. Because people often reveal far more about themselves when they believe they're completely safe from consequences. And my daughter-in-law clearly believed that tonight was one of those safe moments. Her father, who had been listening quietly until now, suddenly spoke up with a proud smile, mentioning the impressive guest list his family had arranged for the reception. According to him, several very important people were attending that evening: investors, business partners, community leaders. The way he said it made it sound as though the wedding itself was less about family and more about displaying influence. I noticed him glance at me briefly while he spoke, the way someone might glance at a stranger sitting at the wrong table during a formal event. He wasn't openly rude, but the message was there all the same. And as the conversation continued, I began to notice something interesting happening around the ballroom. Some guests were starting to pay closer attention to our table. Not because they recognized me, at least not yet, but because moments of tension have a strange way of drawing quiet audiences. A few people stopped their conversations to watch the interaction between the two families. A waiter passing by slowed slightly as if sensing that the atmosphere had shifted. Even the music from the band seemed to fade into the background as more eyes drifted in our direction. My daughter-in-law didn't notice any of that yet. She was too busy enjoying the attention she had created. And just as the laughter around the table began building again, she leaned forward slightly and said something that made the entire group fall silent for a moment before erupting in another round of amused reactions. It was a sentence clearly meant to finish the joke she had started earlier, a sentence designed to make sure everyone remembered exactly who the evening's target was supposed to be. But what she didn't realize, not yet, was that the more confidently she spoke, the closer she was getting to a moment she would eventually wish had never happened. Because in my experience, arrogance usually has a very predictable pattern. It grows louder, bolder, more comfortable with every passing minute. And eventually, if you give it enough time, it reveals itself so completely that the truth becomes impossible for anyone in the room to ignore. And that night at my son's wedding, my daughter-in-law was only just getting started. You see, when someone starts enjoying the sound of their own arrogance, they rarely notice the exact moment when a joke stops being funny and starts becoming a mistake. And my daughter-in-law, standing there with a champagne glass in her hand and an entire table of relatives encouraging her, had clearly reached that moment without realizing it. The laughter from her earlier comments had given her confidence, the kind of confidence that convinces people they are the smartest person in the room. She leaned slightly closer to the table, lowering her voice just enough to make everyone lean in, the way people do when they believe they're about to hear the best part of a story. "The funny thing," she said, glancing at her cousins before looking back toward me again, "is that when we first started planning the wedding, I actually asked my husband if his family would feel overwhelmed by an event like this. A few people around the table chuckled immediately, already understanding the direction she was taking the story. One of her friends even covered her mouth as she laughed, like someone preparing for a punchline they were certain would be worth hearing. My son shifted uncomfortably in his seat again, but by now the conversation had developed its own momentum. My daughter-in-law tilted her head slightly and continued, smiling in a way that suggested she believed the entire room was on her side. You know, big venue, formal reception, hundreds of guests. Not everyone grows up around things like that. The relatives around her nodded in agreement, some of them casting brief glances at me as if the statement required silent confirmation. Now, I should tell you something important about human behavior that I learned after decades of listening to people speak under pressure. When someone is confident that they hold the higher ground in a conversation, they often stop choosing their words carefully. And that is usually the exact moment when their true character begins to show. My daughter-in-law lifted her glass again and gestured loosely toward me. But thankfully, she added with a light laugh, my parents helped make sure the wedding looked the way it should. The table erupted again, this time louder than before, the kind of laughter that comes from a group of people who believe they're sharing a harmless inside joke. But the problem with laughter like that is that it often encourages people to go one step further than they should. And that's exactly what happened next. One of her cousins leaned forward with a grin and asked loudly enough for nearby tables to hear, "So what did your husband's family contribute?" It was meant to sound playful, but everyone sitting there understood the real question hiding behind it. My daughter-in-law paused dramatically as if considering how to answer. Then she smiled and said something that made several guests burst into laughter so loudly that people across the ballroom began turning their heads to see what was happening. "Well," she said casually, "I guess you could say they provided the humility." That word hung in the air for a moment before the table exploded into laughter again. Some of the relatives slapped the table, others leaned back in their chairs shaking their heads in amusement. From their perspective, it was a clever remark. A harmless way of reinforcing the idea that one side of the family brought prestige while the other brought, well, something less impressive. And I could see several nearby guests now openly watching our table, curious about the source of the commotion. A wedding reception, after all, rarely provides such obvious entertainment. But here's the interesting part about moments like that. While everyone else in the room focuses on the laughter, the person at the center of the joke usually notices something very different. I noticed the way the bride's father kept glancing at me, trying to read my reaction. I noticed the subtle tension in my son's shoulders as he stared down at the tablecloth, clearly wishing the conversation would end. And most importantly, I noticed how comfortable my daughter-in-law had become with the role she had chosen for the evening. "Well," she said casually, "at least my husband had the sense to marry into a family that could teach him how things work in the real world." The comment drew another round of scattered laughter, though noticeably quieter this time. And while the guests around the table reacted to her remark, I noticed something interesting happening with her father. He wasn't laughing anymore. Instead, he was staring directly at me, his expression tightening slightly as if a memory had finally surfaced that he couldn't quite ignore. He leaned forward a little and looked more carefully at my face, studying it the way someone studies a photograph they feel they've seen before. For several seconds he didn't speak. He simply observed, the way a person does when they're trying to confirm whether an uncomfortable thought might actually be true. And then he did something that caused the first real ripple of tension across the table. He stood up. Not abruptly, not angrily, just slowly enough that several people around him noticed the movement. Conversations nearby began to quiet again as he took a step closer to where I was sitting. My daughter-in-law looked up at him, confused by the sudden shift in his behavior. "Dad?" she asked with a small laugh, clearly expecting him to join the conversation the way he had earlier in the evening. But instead of answering immediately, he kept his eyes fixed on me. I could see the realization forming now, slowly but unmistakably, like someone solving a puzzle they had accidentally ignored earlier. And when he finally spoke, his voice was much quieter than it had been during the laughter only minutes before. "Excuse me," he said carefully, glancing between me and the rest of the table. "But have we met before?" And that was the moment the story truly began to change. Because when someone asks that question in a room full of witnesses, it usually means they're starting to understand something that everyone else has missed. And my daughter-in-law was about to discover that the old man she had chosen as the punchline of her wedding speech wasn't quite the stranger she thought he was. Now when someone asks you a question like that in a room full of people, the way you answer can shape everything that happens next. And over the years I've learned that sometimes the most powerful response is the simplest one. So when the bride's father stood there studying my face and asked whether we had met before, I didn't rush to explain anything. I simply looked up at him calmly and gave a small, polite smile. "It's possible," I said. "I've met a great many people over the years." My answer was deliberately vague, and that seemed to make him even more uneasy. You see, vague answers are uncomfortable for people who are used to being certain about their surroundings. He remained standing beside the table for a moment, clearly debating something in his mind while several relatives watched him curiously. My daughter-in-law looked from him to me with growing impatience, clearly confused about why the conversation had suddenly become so serious. "Dad, what are you doing?" she said with a nervous laugh. "You're acting like he's someone important." A few guests chuckled lightly at that remark, but the laughter didn't spread the way it had earlier. Too many people had already noticed the change in her father's expression. He didn't laugh at her comment. Instead, he kept looking at me, the same careful look someone uses when they're trying to confirm a suspicion that might have consequences. Finally he spoke again, this time choosing his words more cautiously. "Your name?" he asked. Now that question carried a very different weight. Several people at the table fell quiet, sensing that something unusual was happening. My daughter-in-law rolled her eyes slightly as if she thought her father was overreacting to a harmless situation. But curiosity had already begun spreading across the ballroom. A few nearby guests had turned their chairs slightly so they could hear the conversation better. Even the band on the small stage across the room had paused between songs, leaving the background noise softer than before. I looked up at the bride's father and answered in the same calm tone I had used all evening. "Arthur Whitmore," I said. The reaction was immediate, though not dramatic at first. The bride's father blinked once, as if the name had triggered a thought he wasn't expecting. Then his posture changed slightly, the way people straighten when something important suddenly enters their mind. One of the men standing a few steps behind him leaned closer and whispered something quickly into his ear. I couldn't hear the words, but I saw the effect they had. The bride's father's face went noticeably pale. My daughter-in-law noticed it too. "Dad?" she said again, her voice now carrying a hint of concern instead of amusement. "Why do you look like that?" He didn't answer her right away. Instead he looked back at me again, more carefully than before, as if studying every detail of my face. Then he glanced around the room, noticing that several other guests had begun watching the interaction with interest. It was clear he was piecing together something that the rest of the table still didn't understand. Meanwhile, my daughter-in-law crossed her arms and shook her head impatiently. "Okay, seriously," she said, forcing another laugh. "What is going on?" "He's just—" She stopped mid-sentence when her father suddenly raised his hand slightly, signaling her to be quiet. That alone surprised the entire table. Only minutes earlier he had been laughing along with the rest of his relatives, clearly enjoying the attention his daughter was receiving. Now he looked like a man who had just realized he might need to repair a situation quickly. "Arthur Whitmore," he repeated slowly, almost to himself. "The judge." That single word seemed to travel across the nearby tables faster than any of the earlier jokes had. One of the guests near the bar turned his head sharply in our direction. Another man standing beside him frowned and took out his phone, typing something quickly while glancing back at me. The bride's father noticed those reactions too, and I could see the tension building in his shoulders. Meanwhile, my daughter-in-law looked completely bewildered. "Judge?" she said, frowning. "Dad, why would a judge be at our wedding?" Her question might have sounded innocent, but the timing couldn't have been worse. Because by then several people around the room had already begun whispering the name to each other. In certain circles, a name like mine tends to carry a bit of recognition, even years after retirement. The bride's father clearly understood that better than his daughter did. He stepped closer to the table, lowering his voice slightly as he spoke again. "You were on the federal bench for a long time, weren't you?" he asked carefully. I nodded once. "Yes," I said. "For quite a while." That confirmation seemed to drain the last bit of color from his face. And suddenly the man who had been enjoying the evening with confident laughter looked like someone who had just realized the entire tone of the wedding might have shifted in a very uncomfortable direction. Meanwhile, my daughter-in-law was still trying to process the change happening around her. She glanced at the relatives who had been laughing earlier and noticed that none of them were smiling anymore. Several were whispering quietly to each other, clearly trying to understand why her father now looked so tense. And that was the moment when the first real silence settled over our table. Because the guests who had been enjoying the spectacle were beginning to realize that the story they thought they were watching might not be quite as simple as they believed. And my daughter-in-law, who had spent the entire evening presenting me as the least important person in the room, was about to learn why judging someone too quickly can turn a celebration into a very uncomfortable lesson. There's a very particular kind of silence that appears when people suddenly realize they might have been laughing at the wrong person. It's not loud, it's not dramatic, it's subtle. Conversations slow down, people stop smiling as easily, and suddenly everyone begins paying attention in a way they weren't a few minutes earlier. That's exactly what happened at our table after the bride's father repeated my name and mentioned the federal bench. The relatives who had been so comfortable laughing moments before were now sitting a little straighter in their chairs, glancing between me and him as if trying to understand why his reaction had changed so quickly. My daughter-in-law, however, still looked irritated more than concerned. She clearly didn't see what the problem was yet. In her mind, the situation probably still looked like an awkward overreaction to a harmless wedding joke. "Dad," she said quietly, leaning toward him with a frustrated smile, "you're acting like this is some kind of courtroom." A couple of her cousins forced small laughs, but they stopped almost immediately when they noticed that her father wasn't amused at all. Instead, he kept looking at me in that careful way people do when they suddenly realize they're standing much closer to something important than they originally thought. I could see the thoughts moving behind his eyes, connecting details he had ignored earlier, the way I had stayed calm during the jokes, the fact that I hadn't once tried to defend myself, the strange confidence that had apparently confused several guests already. Because the truth is, when someone has spent decades observing people in difficult situations, it becomes surprisingly easy to remain calm while others lose control of the conversation around you. My daughter-in-law, unfortunately, mistook that calmness for weakness. She sighed dramatically and lifted her glass again, clearly trying to bring the mood back to what it had been earlier. "Look," she said lightly, "I didn't realize we were supposed to treat introductions like legal proceedings." That remark earned a few scattered chuckles from the more stubborn members of her family, the ones who still wanted to believe the evening's story hadn't changed. But those chuckles were noticeably quieter now, almost cautious. Because several other guests around the table were watching her with expressions that suggested they were beginning to understand something she didn't. Her father certainly understood it. I noticed the way his jaw tightened slightly after her comment, the subtle signal of someone who wished a conversation had gone very differently. "That's not what this is about," he said quietly. My daughter-in-law frowned, clearly annoyed by his serious tone. "Then what is it about?" she asked. He didn't answer immediately. Instead he looked around the table, noticing that the nearby guests had stopped pretending not to listen. Several people were openly watching now, their curiosity stronger than their desire to avoid family drama. Even the waiters moving between tables had slowed slightly as they passed by, sensing that something unusual was unfolding. Finally the bride's father looked back at me and spoke again, choosing his words with noticeable care. "You said your name is Arthur Whitmore," he began. "Yes," I replied calmly. He nodded slowly as if confirming the last piece of a puzzle he had been assembling in his mind. Then he glanced at his daughter again, and I could see a flicker of frustration cross his face, the frustration of someone realizing that a situation had been handled very poorly. "And you are?" He hesitated for a second, clearly aware that the entire table was waiting for the answer now. My daughter-in-law leaned back in her chair with an impatient expression, tapping her fingers lightly against the glass in front of her. She clearly expected the explanation to be something simple that would allow everyone to laugh again and move on. But the bride's father didn't look amused anymore. He looked cautious, almost uneasy. "You are the father of the groom," he finished carefully. I nodded once. "That's correct." For a moment no one spoke. The relatives who had spent the last half hour enjoying the conversation seemed unsure whether they were supposed to say something or remain quiet. My daughter-in-law broke the silence with a short laugh. "Okay, so," she said. "We already knew that." Her father closed his eyes briefly, the way someone does when they realize they are about to have a very uncomfortable conversation with their own child. When he opened them again he looked directly at her. "What you didn't know," he said slowly, "is that your father-in-law is not just someone's father." She frowned, clearly confused by the seriousness in his voice. "Then what is he?" she asked. The room had become so quiet by that point that even the guests at nearby tables had turned their chairs slightly to listen. And when the bride's father answered her question, his voice was low enough that everyone had to lean forward to hear it clearly. "He's Judge Arthur Whitmore." That name hung in the air for several seconds. Across the ballroom, I noticed two guests exchange surprised looks. Another man near the bar lowered his phone slowly after checking something on the screen. And at our table, the relatives who had been laughing earlier now looked at each other with expressions that suggested they were beginning to realize the evening might not end the way they had expected. Meanwhile my daughter-in-law sat there staring at her father, clearly waiting for the part where he explained why that was supposed to matter. Because arrogance has a curious way of blinding people to the significance of information that makes everyone else nervous. And unfortunately for her, that blindness was about to turn a wedding joke into something far more memorable than she ever intended. Now the interesting thing about recognition is that it rarely arrives at the same time for everyone in a room. Some people understand immediately, others need a few extra seconds, and a few stubborn ones refuse to see it even when the truth is standing right in front of them. At our table that night, you could watch that process unfold almost person by person. When my daughter-in-law's father said my name again, this time with the word judge attached to it, a few guests reacted instantly. One of the men sitting 2 chairs away leaned back with a quiet, "Oh," the kind of sound people make when a memory suddenly connects to something they've heard before. Another guest near the edge of the table straightened in his chair and looked at me more carefully, his expression shifting from mild amusement to something closer to respect. But my daughter-in-law didn't share their reaction. She looked at her father with the same puzzled expression she had been wearing since the conversation changed direction. "Dad," she said slowly, "I still don't understand why you're saying it like that." Her voice carried a faint irritation now, the irritation of someone who felt the attention had been pulled away from her at the exact moment she expected to be entertaining the room. "He's a judge. So what?" A few people at the table shifted uncomfortably when she said that. Not because the words themselves were offensive, but because the tone behind them suggested she still believed the situation hadn't changed. Her father inhaled slowly through his nose, clearly trying to keep his composure. "I've seen that expression before, the expression of a man realizing he may need to explain something very delicate in front of an audience that has already witnessed too much." "Not just a judge," he said carefully. My daughter-in-law tilted her head slightly, clearly waiting for him to finish the sentence. The rest of the table leaned closer without meaning to. Even some guests at the neighboring tables had stopped pretending to mind their own business by then. My daughter-in-law's father glanced around the room briefly, noticing how many people were paying attention now. Then he lowered his voice slightly and continued. "Arthur Whitmore served on the federal bench for more than 2 decades. The reaction was immediate in certain corners of the room. Someone behind him muttered a surprised, 'Seriously?' under their breath. A woman at the next table whispered something quickly to the man beside her, and he turned his head sharply in my direction. But my daughter-in-law still hadn't reached the same conclusion. She leaned back in her chair and folded her arms, clearly unimpressed. "Okay, and," she asked, "now I should tell you something about moments like that. Sometimes people become so invested in a story they've created that they refuse to abandon it even when the facts start pushing against it." In her mind, she had already decided what role I played in the evening, the quiet, unimpressive father-in-law who was easy to joke about. And changing that story now would require admitting she had misjudged the situation. Her father clearly understood that, which made his next words even more careful. "And before that," he continued, "he spent years working inside the federal legal system." That explanation made several guests exchange glances again. One of the bride's uncles leaned closer to another relative and whispered something while looking at me with new interest. But my daughter-in-law simply shook her head as if the entire discussion was becoming unnecessarily dramatic. "I still don't see why everyone is acting like this is some huge revelation," she said. "He's retired. Lots of people are retired." That was the moment when a quiet ripple of discomfort passed through the table. Because by then most of the adults present had begun to realize something she hadn't yet grasped. That certain careers leave behind more than just a title when someone retires. They leave behind reputations, relationships, and influence that doesn't disappear the moment a person stops working. Her father seemed to understand that perfectly. He leaned slightly closer to her and spoke in a lower voice, though not low enough to prevent others from hearing. "When someone spends 20 years as a federal judge," he said slowly, "they tend to know a lot of people." That sentence landed very differently than the earlier explanations. A few relatives nodded almost instinctively. The man who had been checking his phone earlier suddenly slipped it back into his pocket and avoided looking in my direction altogether. Meanwhile, my daughter-in-law looked around the table and finally began noticing the change in everyone's expressions. The laughter that had filled the room earlier was gone. In its place was something much quieter, curiosity mixed with the faint discomfort of people realizing they might have been part of a very unfortunate misunderstanding. She looked back at her father again, confusion finally replacing the confidence she had been wearing all evening. "Are you saying I did something wrong?" she asked. Her father didn't answer immediately. Instead he glanced at me again, almost as if measuring how I had reacted to everything that had happened so far. When he looked back at his daughter, his expression had softened slightly, but the tension in his voice remained. "I'm saying," he replied carefully, "that sometimes it's wise to understand who someone is before deciding how to speak about them. That sentence hung in the air for a moment, heavier than anything that had been said earlier in the evening. And around us, the guests who had once been laughing at the joke were now sitting very quietly, waiting to see what would happen next. Because the story that had started as simple wedding entertainment had slowly transformed into something far more uncomfortable. And my daughter-in-law, who had been enjoying the role of host and storyteller all night, was beginning to realize that the audience in front of her was no longer laughing. By that point in the evening, something very interesting had happened inside that ballroom, something people don't usually notice until it's already too late to change it. The power in the room had quietly shifted. Earlier, my daughter-in-law had been the center of attention. Every joke she made had been rewarded with laughter. Every remark had been encouraged by relatives who enjoyed the little performance she was putting on. But now the attention had moved somewhere else entirely. People weren't watching her anymore. They were watching me. And when a room full of people suddenly stops laughing and starts observing, the person who was telling the jokes often feels that change before they fully understand it. I could see that realization slowly creeping into my daughter-in-law's expression. Her arms were still folded, but the confidence that had been there earlier had begun to soften. She glanced around the table again, noticing the quiet conversations that had started between relatives only minutes before. The same cousins who had been laughing the loudest were now avoiding eye contact with her father, and one of her friends was staring down at the tablecloth as if studying the pattern suddenly felt very important. "This is getting a little ridiculous," she said after a moment, forcing a small laugh that didn't quite sound natural anymore. "All I did was make a couple of jokes." Her father didn't respond right away. Instead, he remained standing beside the table, his expression thoughtful in a way that suggested he was trying to decide how much needed to be said in front of everyone watching. And by then there were quite a few people watching. Guests at nearby tables had turned their chairs slightly in our direction. A few people near the bar were whispering quietly to each other while glancing over every few seconds. Even the band members on the stage seemed to sense the shift in atmosphere, speaking softly among themselves as they waited to see if the reception would return to normal. My daughter-in-law's father finally spoke again, though his tone was calmer now, less like someone reacting to a surprise and more like someone trying to repair a situation that had gone too far. "Jokes are fine," he said quietly. "But sometimes jokes say more than we intend." My daughter-in-law frowned slightly. "What's that supposed to mean?" she asked. He gestured lightly toward the table where her relatives were sitting, the same group that had been laughing earlier in the evening. "You spent the last half hour explaining what kind of family your husband comes from," he said. "And most of the room believed you." That comment made several people shift uncomfortably in their chairs. Because once a statement like that is spoken out loud, it becomes difficult to pretend the situation was harmless. My daughter-in-law looked at me briefly for the first time since the conversation had changed direction. The look wasn't angry, it was more confused than anything else, like someone trying to understand how the story she had been telling about me no longer seemed to match the reality unfolding in front of her. "I wasn't explaining anything," she said defensively. "I was just talking." Her father sighed quietly, the way someone sighs when they know an explanation might not solve the problem anymore. "Sometimes talking is exactly the problem," he replied. For a moment the table went completely silent again. Several relatives were staring down at their glasses. One of the bride's uncles cleared his throat awkwardly and looked toward the stage as if hoping the band would start playing again and end the conversation. But the silence continued. Finally my daughter-in-law turned toward me again, her expression now carrying something she hadn't shown all evening: uncertainty. "I didn't realize my comments were that serious," she said slowly. It was the closest thing to an apology anyone had offered so far, though it didn't quite reach that level yet. And that's when I decided it was finally time to speak a little more clearly. Because up until that moment I had mostly allowed the room to reach its own conclusions. But sometimes a situation needs a gentle reminder of perspective. I leaned forward slightly and folded my hands on the table in front of me. "Weddings are emotional events," I said calmly. "People say things they might not say in other settings." My tone wasn't angry or accusatory. In fact, a few people looked relieved to hear a voice that didn't sound confrontational. But I continued speaking before the conversation could drift away again. "The interesting part," I added, "isn't the joke itself." Several guests leaned closer without realizing it. My daughter-in-law looked at me carefully now, clearly trying to understand where the conversation was going. I gave a small, patient smile before finishing the thought. "The interesting part," I said, "is what the joke reveals about how people see each other." That sentence settled over the table like a quiet weight. Because suddenly the entire evening looked slightly different than it had before. What had started as harmless entertainment now looked more like a moment that had exposed something deeper about pride, assumptions, and the way people treat others when they believe status is on their side. My daughter-in-law didn't speak for several seconds after that. She simply stared at the table, her earlier confidence slowly dissolving into something quieter. And across the ballroom, guests who had been watching the scene unfold were beginning to realize that the wedding they had come to celebrate had unexpectedly turned into something else entirely. Not an argument. Not a dramatic confrontation. But a lesson. And the most uncomfortable part of that lesson for my daughter-in-law was that she had delivered the opening speech herself without realizing it. By that point, the ballroom had become strangely quiet in a way that weddings rarely are. Music had paused between songs, glasses rested untouched on the tables, and the easy laughter that usually fills celebrations had been replaced by something far more attentive. People weren't looking for entertainment anymore. They were looking for understanding. And the center of that understanding was now sitting at our table. My daughter-in-law remained silent for a moment after I finished speaking, her eyes still lowered toward the tablecloth as if the pattern there had suddenly become very interesting. That silence alone said a great deal. Earlier in the evening she had been quick with every remark, eager to keep the conversation moving and the laughter flowing. Now she seemed to be searching for words much more carefully. Her father watched her closely, clearly hoping she would choose those words wisely this time. Around us, the relatives who had once been enjoying the jokes were now sitting in the uncomfortable position that often follows a moment of realization. Some people shifted in their chairs, others glanced around the room as if checking whether anyone else had noticed their earlier reactions. A few guests at nearby tables quietly resumed their conversations, but even those voices remained low, respectful of the tension that still lingered near our table. My daughter-in-law finally looked up again, though the confident smile she had worn earlier was gone. In its place was the cautious expression of someone who had begun to understand that the situation might not be as simple as she first believed. "I didn't mean to offend anyone," she said slowly. The words sounded sincere, though they carried the careful tone of someone stepping onto unfamiliar ground. Her father nodded slightly, encouraging her to continue. "Weddings can be stressful," she added. "Sometimes people try too hard to keep the atmosphere light." A few relatives murmured in quiet agreement, clearly relieved to hear the conversation moving in a calmer direction. But I could also see that several guests were still waiting to hear what would come next. Because apologies, like jokes, often reveal more than the speaker intends. I gave a small nod, acknowledging her effort. "That's true," I said gently. "Celebrations bring out strong emotions." My answer seemed to relax a few people around the table, though the bride's father remained attentive, his eyes moving between the two of us as if making sure the conversation stayed balanced. My daughter-in-law hesitated for a moment before speaking again. "I suppose," she said carefully, "I might have made assumptions earlier." That sentence carried a different weight than her earlier explanations. The relatives who had been sitting quietly now looked at her with more interest, recognizing that she had finally reached the heart of the issue. Assumptions are powerful things. They shape the way people speak, the way they judge others, and sometimes the way entire families see each other. I folded my hands together and leaned back slightly in my chair. "Assumptions are common," I replied calmly. "Most people make them without realizing it." She nodded slowly as if considering that idea for the first time. "I guess I thought I understood what kind of family my husband came from," she admitted. That statement caused another subtle ripple of discomfort among the relatives. Because once spoken out loud, it made the earlier joke sound very different. Her father cleared his throat quietly, perhaps hoping the conversation would shift towards something less revealing. But the guests who had been listening were already drawing their own conclusions. My daughter-in-law looked around the table again and seemed to notice those reactions for the first time. The laughter she had expected from her remarks earlier in the evening had vanished completely. In its place was a room full of thoughtful faces, many of them now studying her with the same curiosity she had once directed toward me. And that's when the true lesson of the evening began to settle over the room. Because sometimes the most powerful moments of change happen not through confrontation, but through realization. My daughter-in-law had started the evening believing she understood the story of the family she had married into. She believed she knew who held status and who didn't, who belonged in certain circles and who simply existed on the edge of them. But now the audience she had once entertained was beginning to see the story differently. The man she had described as a quiet, unremarkable father-in-law had turned out to be someone whose life carried a great deal more experience and influence than anyone expected. And the young woman who had seemed so confident only minutes earlier was now facing the uncomfortable truth that her assumptions had been made far too quickly. My daughter-in-law took a slow breath and looked directly at me again. "I suppose," she said, "there are things I didn't know." Her voice was quieter now, but there was sincerity in it. I nodded once more, keeping my tone as calm as before. "There are always things we don't know about the people around us," I replied. "That's why respect is such a safe place to start." That sentence seemed to settle the matter more effectively than any argument could have. Several relatives nodded thoughtfully, and the tension that had filled the room earlier began to soften slightly. Conversations resumed at nearby tables, and the musicians on stage quietly prepared to begin playing again. The wedding celebration would continue as celebrations usually do, but the atmosphere had changed in a way that everyone present would remember. Because the evening had offered a reminder that pride and assumptions often travel together. And when they meet patience and experience, the result can be a lesson no one planned to attend. And as the music slowly returned to the ballroom and guests lifted their glasses once again, I couldn't help but reflect on the strange path the night had taken. What began as a moment of public humiliation had quietly transformed into something else entirely. A reminder that the way we treat people often reveals more about us than it does about them. And that, in the end, is a verdict every family eventually has to face. As the musicians slowly began playing again and the soft sound of conversation returned to the ballroom, something about the atmosphere had clearly changed. It wasn't dramatic or chaotic the way people imagine when they hear about uncomfortable family moments. In fact, if someone had walked into the room at that exact moment, they might have believed the reception had simply paused for a brief conversation and then resumed like any other wedding celebration. But the people who had been sitting at our table knew better. They had watched the evening shift from laughter to silence, from assumptions to understanding, and that kind of shift leaves a memory behind that doesn't disappear just because the music starts again. My daughter-in-law sat quietly for a few seconds after our conversation ended, her earlier confidence replaced by a thoughtful calm that hadn't been there before. She looked around the table again, noticing the way several relatives avoided meeting her eyes, perhaps remembering how quickly they had joined the laughter earlier in the evening. Her father finally sat back down in his chair, though his posture remained straight and attentive. I suspect he was relieved that the situation had settled without turning into something more dramatic. In families, after all, dignity is sometimes preserved by the absence of confrontation rather than the presence of it. My son, who had been silent through most of the exchange, finally exhaled in a way that suggested he had been holding his breath for much longer than anyone realized. He glanced at me briefly, his expression carrying both gratitude and a bit of embarrassment. Weddings can place people in difficult positions, especially when two families are still learning how to understand each other. And while I could see that he wished the evening had unfolded differently, I also knew that moments like this often teach lessons that quiet conversations never could. My daughter-in-law eventually turned toward me again. This time her voice carried none of the playful sarcasm from earlier in the evening. Instead, there was something far more genuine in the way she spoke. "Arthur," she said carefully, using my name for the first time that night instead of referring to me indirectly through jokes or stories. "I hope you know I didn't intend to disrespect you. Now, intentions are complicated things. People often mean one thing while their words suggest something entirely different." But the fact that she was willing to say that in front of the same relatives who had laughed earlier told me she had begun to understand the situation more clearly than before. I gave her a small nod. "Weddings are full of emotions," I said. "Sometimes people speak before they've had time to think." She seemed relieved by that answer, though the lesson behind it remained clear to everyone who had been listening. Her father leaned slightly toward her and placed a quiet hand on the table, the gesture of a man who wanted the evening to move forward rather than remain trapped in an uncomfortable moment. "Let's focus on the reason we're all here," he said calmly. "Two people just started their life together." That suggestion was met with quiet agreement around the table. Glasses were lifted again, conversations restarted, and slowly the celebration found its rhythm once more. But even as the room filled with music and laughter again, there was a new sense of awareness among the guests who had witnessed the exchange. Because people rarely forget moments when their assumptions are challenged in front of others. A little while later my daughter-in-law stood and walked around the table toward where I was sitting. The movement caught several guests' attention, though the music helped soften the focus on our corner of the room. She stopped beside me and spoke quietly enough that only I could hear her clearly. "I think tonight taught me something," she said. I looked up at her with the same calm patience I had shown all evening. "What's that?" I asked. She hesitated for a moment, choosing her words carefully. "That it's dangerous to decide who someone is before you actually know them." I allowed myself a small smile at that answer. "That's a very useful lesson," I said. It saves people from many future misunderstandings. She nodded once, then returned to her seat beside my son. The music continued, the guests danced, and the wedding celebration eventually became lively again the way weddings usually do. But the earlier moment lingered quietly in the background of the evening, not as a scandal or an argument, but as something more meaningful. Later that night, as the reception began winding down and people prepared to leave, several guests approached me politely to introduce themselves. Some mentioned my years on the bench, others simply said they had enjoyed our conversation earlier. Their tone carried a kind of respectful curiosity that hadn't been there at the beginning of the night. And as I stepped outside the ballroom for a moment of quiet air, I reflected on the strange path the evening had taken. My daughter-in-law had tried to turn me into the subject of a joke in front of hundreds of guests. Instead, she had unknowingly created a moment that reminded everyone present of something far more important. Respect isn't something that should depend on status, reputation, or titles. It's the starting point of every healthy relationship, especially inside a family. Because families, more than any courtroom or business meeting, eventually reach their own conclusions about how people treat each other. And when those conclusions are reached, they become something I like to call the family verdict. That night at my son's wedding, the verdict was simple, and it didn't come from a judge's bench. It came from the quiet realization shared by everyone who had witnessed the moment. Never assume you know someone's worth before you've taken the time to understand who they truly are. Now, if you think the story ended neatly the moment the music started again, let me ask you something that many people and families eventually experience. Have you ever had a moment where something embarrassing happened in front of a crowd, and later you wondered what people were saying about it after the room cleared? Because weddings may last only one evening, but the conversations they create often travel far beyond the ballroom. And that night was no exception. The reception eventually ended the way most weddings do, with tired smiles, half-empty glasses, and guests slowly gathering their coats while saying their goodbyes. But I noticed something interesting as people began leaving the hall. Several relatives from my daughter-in-law's side approached our table with noticeably different expressions than the ones they had worn earlier. The same cousins who had laughed at the jokes earlier now spoke with a polite formality, introducing themselves properly and asking about my work, my life, and the years I had spent on the federal bench. It wasn't exaggerated respect, and I wouldn't call it fear either. It was something simpler, the natural shift that happens when people realize they might have misjudged someone. One man in particular, an uncle of the bride, shook my hand firmly and said something that stayed with me. I suppose tonight reminded all of us to listen before forming opinions. I nodded politely and thanked him for the conversation, but the truth is that his remark described the entire evening better than anything else. Meanwhile, my daughter-in-law had grown noticeably quieter as the night progressed. Not withdrawn or upset, but thoughtful. There's a difference between someone who feels embarrassed and someone who is reflecting on something they've learned. And I suspected she was experiencing a bit of both. At one point near the end of the evening, my son came over and sat beside me for a moment. He looked exhausted in the way only a groom can look after a long wedding day, but there was also relief in his expression. "Dad," he said quietly, "thank you for being patient tonight." I gave him a small smile. "Patience is a useful habit," I replied. He chuckled softly at that and rubbed the back of his neck, clearly remembering the moment when the entire ballroom had been focused on our table. "I was worried it might turn into something worse," he admitted. "It didn't need to," I said calmly. Because the truth is, when someone reveals their assumptions publicly, the most powerful response is often calm dignity. Anger would have turned the moment into a spectacle. Silence, on the other hand, allowed the room to discover the truth on its own. And people tend to remember those discoveries much longer. A little while later, when the reception hall had nearly emptied, my daughter-in-law approached again. This time there were no relatives around, no audience waiting to see what would happen. Just the three of us standing near the exit of the ballroom while staff members quietly cleared the tables behind us. She looked slightly nervous, though she tried to hide it with a polite smile. "Arthur," she said, "before everyone leaves, I wanted to say something properly." My son looked at her with mild surprise, but he remained quiet. She took a small breath before continuing. "Earlier tonight I spoke about you like I understood who you were," she said. "But I didn't. And I think everyone saw that. That kind of honesty is rare in public situations, especially after a moment of embarrassment." I respected her for it. "Understanding people takes time," I replied gently. "Families usually have many years to learn about each other." She nodded slowly, clearly relieved that the conversation wasn't turning into another uncomfortable exchange. "I hope we can start over," she said. My son glanced at me, waiting to see how I would respond. I simply smiled. Families start over all the time, I said. That's one of their greatest strengths. The tension in her shoulders seemed to ease immediately after that. She thanked me quietly, then walked toward the exit with my son as they prepared to leave for the final part of their wedding night. And as I watched them go, I couldn't help thinking about how strange the evening had been. A moment that started with public embarrassment had turned into a lesson that reached far beyond one person's mistake. Because everyone in that ballroom had witnessed the same transformation. How quickly assumptions can crumble when patience meets arrogance. And in the days that followed, I heard from several guests who had been at the wedding. Some of them wrote short messages, others called simply to say they enjoyed meeting me. But what interested me most was the one thing nearly all of them mentioned. Not the jokes. Not the tension. Not even the surprise about my career. They talked about the calm way the moment had unfolded. Because people expect confrontation when pride is challenged. What they rarely expect is quiet restraint. And sometimes restraint delivers the most memorable verdict of all. But the story doesn't quite end there. Because a few weeks after the wedding, something happened inside our family that proved the lesson from that evening had truly been understood. And that moment changed the relationship between my daughter-in-law and me in a way no one in that ballroom could have predicted. A few weeks after the wedding, life began returning to its normal rhythm the way it always does after a big celebration. The photographs were posted online, relatives shared stories about the reception, and slowly the excitement of the event settled into memory. But something interesting happens after moments like the one we experienced that night. People don't just forget them, they think about them. They replay them quietly in their minds, sometimes realizing things they didn't fully understand in the moment. And apparently my daughter-in-law had been doing exactly that. One afternoon not long after the wedding, I received a phone call from my son. His voice sounded slightly hesitant in the way someone sounds when they are about to ask a favor. "Dad," he said, "are you busy this weekend?" I told him I wasn't. He paused for a moment before continuing. "Emily was wondering if we could come by for dinner." Now that may not sound unusual to most people. Families visit each other all the time. But the tone in his voice suggested there was a reason behind the invitation. "Of course," I replied calmly. "You're both welcome anytime." When the weekend arrived, they came by in the early evening. My daughter-in-law looked slightly nervous as they walked into the house, though she greeted me warmly and thanked me for inviting them. We sat down in the living room for a while before dinner, talking about ordinary things, work, the honeymoon, the small adjustments that come with the first weeks of married life. At first the conversation felt completely normal, almost as if the awkward moment at the wedding had never happened. But eventually the reason for their visit became clear. My daughter-in-law set her cup down on the table and looked at me with a seriousness that reminded me of the moment she had approached me near the end of the reception. "Arthur," she said quietly, "there's something I've been thinking about since the wedding." My son shifted slightly in his chair, clearly aware of where the conversation was going. I simply nodded for her to continue. "That night," she said slowly, "I spoke about your family in a way I shouldn't have." She wasn't rushing the words. Each sentence sounded carefully considered, the way people speak when they want to be certain they are understood. "It wasn't just the jokes," she added. "It was the assumptions behind them." I listened patiently, allowing her the space to say what she needed to say. "The truth is," she continued, "I thought I understood what kind of people I was marrying into. I believed certain things about success and status that weren't very fair." My son looked at her with quiet admiration. It's not easy to admit mistakes, especially when they've happened in front of hundreds of witnesses. She glanced at him briefly before returning her attention to me. "After the wedding," she said, "a few relatives talked to me about what happened. Not in a cruel way, but in a way that made me realize how quickly I had judged someone I barely knew." I leaned back slightly in my chair, watching the sincerity in her expression. "Realizations like that are uncomfortable," I said gently. "But they're also valuable." She nodded slowly. "That's why I wanted to come here today," she said. "Not just to apologize again, but to ask something." My son raised an eyebrow with mild curiosity, clearly hearing this request for the first time as well. "What would you like to ask?" I replied. She hesitated for a moment before speaking again. "I'd like to get to know you better," she said. "Not as the person I imagined at the wedding, but as the person you actually are." There was a quiet honesty in that request that impressed me more than any formal apology could have. Because relationships inside families aren't repaired through perfect words. They're repaired through willingness, the willingness to start fresh and learn about each other properly. I smiled and nodded. "That sounds like a very reasonable request," I said. The tension in her face softened immediately. My son let out a quiet laugh of relief. And from that moment forward, the dynamic between us began to change in a way none of us expected when the wedding first started. Over the months that followed, my daughter-in-law and I spent more time talking during family gatherings. Sometimes about my years in the legal world, sometimes about her own career and ambitions. The conversations were relaxed, respectful, and surprisingly enjoyable. She even joked once that she was glad she hadn't tried to make those same wedding jokes in front of a courtroom full of lawyers. We both laughed about that. And every so often, someone in the family would mention the famous wedding moment that had started everything. But instead of embarrassment, it eventually became something else. A story about how misunderstandings can lead to better relationships if people are willing to learn from them. Because the truth is, families aren't perfect institutions. They're groups of individuals who bring different expectations, different experiences, and sometimes different egos into the same room. Conflicts are almost inevitable. But what determines the future of a family isn't the conflict itself. It's how people respond once the truth becomes clear. And that brings me to the final thought I often share with my grandchildren when they ask about the strange story of their parents' wedding. I tell them something simple. In courtrooms, judges deliver verdicts based on evidence. But in families, the verdict is delivered by time. And time eventually reveals who was willing to grow, and who wasn't. Fortunately for our family, the verdict after that wedding turned out to be a hopeful one. Because the woman who once tried to humiliate her father-in-law in front of hundreds of guests eventually became someone who understood him, respected him, and, in her own way, even learned from him. And if you ask me, that's a far better ending than any argument could have produced. Now here's something people rarely talk about after a wedding ends. The music stops, the guests go home, the decorations come down, but the stories from that night don't disappear. In fact, that's usually when they begin traveling the fastest. Because families have a remarkable way of revisiting moments that surprised them. And the moment at that reception table, the one that began with laughter and ended with quiet realization, quickly became one of those stories. I didn't notice it immediately, of course. Life moved on in the ordinary ways it always does. My son and his new wife settled into their routine as a married couple. The photographs from the wedding circulated online, and relatives slowly returned to their everyday lives. But over the following weeks, I began hearing little pieces of the story coming back to me from unexpected places. One afternoon, a distant cousin called just to say he had enjoyed the wedding. Toward the end of the conversation, he chuckled softly and said, "You know, people are still talking about that moment during the reception." I asked him what people were saying. He paused for a moment before answering, as if choosing his words carefully. "Most of them say the same thing," he replied. "They say they've never seen someone handle embarrassment that calmly." Now that comment told me something important. Because it meant the guests hadn't walked away remembering the humiliation my daughter-in-law attempted. They remembered the patience that followed it. And patience in situations like that has a curious effect. It changes the way people interpret everything that happened before it. A few days later, I attended a small family dinner on my son's side of the family. It was nothing formal, just a casual evening where relatives gathered to catch up after the wedding. And sure enough, before long someone mentioned the reception again. One of my nieces laughed softly while describing the moment to someone who hadn't been there. "At first everyone thought it was just a joke," she said. "But when her father realized who Uncle Arthur actually was, the whole room changed." Several relatives nodded in agreement, remembering the sudden silence that had swept across the ballroom. But what interested me most wasn't their description of the moment. It was the way they talked about my daughter-in-law afterward. No one spoke with anger. No one mocked her or criticized her harshly. Instead, they spoke about the situation the way people discuss a lesson everyone witnessed together. "She probably didn't realize what she was doing," one cousin said thoughtfully. Another relative added, "Sometimes people grow up hearing certain ideas about status and success, and they don't realize how those ideas sound until someone challenges them." That comment stayed with me, because it captured something deeper about the entire situation. My daughter-in-law hadn't simply told a few jokes at a wedding. She had revealed the assumptions she carried about people, the quiet beliefs she had developed about which families belonged in certain social circles and which ones didn't. And when those assumptions collided with reality, the result had been a moment that hundreds of guests would remember for years. But the most interesting part of the story came a few weeks later when I heard something from my son that surprised even me. We were having lunch together one afternoon when he mentioned a conversation he and his wife had recently had with some of her relatives. "They brought up the wedding again," he said, stirring his coffee slowly. "Apparently the story has been traveling through their side of the family." I raised an eyebrow with mild curiosity. And what are they saying about it? He smiled slightly. Mostly that Emily learned a very important lesson that night. That answer made me chuckle softly. That's a polite way of describing it, I said. My son laughed as well, but then his expression became more thoughtful. Actually, he added, it changed the way some of them see you. I leaned back in my chair. How so? He took a moment before answering, clearly remembering the conversations he had heard. They expected you to get angry, he explained. Or embarrassed. Or defensive. He paused briefly before continuing. But when you stayed calm, it made people rethink the entire situation. That's the interesting thing about composure. In moments where pride might push someone toward confrontation, calmness creates space for reflection instead. And reflection tends to travel much farther through a family than anger ever could. But the story didn't stop there. Because not long after that conversation with my son, something happened that revealed just how far that wedding moment had spread through the extended family, and how differently people were beginning to see the quiet grandfather who had once been the subject of a joke at his own son's wedding. And when my daughter-in-law witnessed that moment herself, I could see something change in her expression that told me the lesson from that night had finally reached its deepest understanding. Now here's something that often determines whether a lesson truly stays with someone or slowly fades away over time. Hearing about a person's reputation is one thing, but witnessing it for yourself is something entirely different. And a few months after the wedding, my daughter-in-law experienced exactly that moment. It happened during a charity dinner that my son and I were invited to attend in the city. The event itself wasn't particularly unusual. It was one of those formal evenings where professionals from different industries gather to support a cause, share conversations, and occasionally make connections that might matter later in their careers. I had attended many of these events over the years, though since retiring I usually kept a fairly low profile. My son suggested that he and Emily come along as well. It'll be good for us to meet some of the people you used to work with, he said casually. Emily seemed interested, though I could tell she wasn't entirely sure what to expect. After all, she had heard about my career by that point, but hearing stories and seeing something firsthand are very different experiences. When we arrived at the event hall, the room was already filled with quiet conversations and the soft clinking of glasses. People were standing in small groups, introducing themselves, discussing their work, and exchanging the polite smiles that usually accompany professional gatherings. At first everything felt perfectly ordinary. We checked in at the entrance, picked up our name cards, and walked into the main reception area together. But within the first few minutes, something began happening that Emily clearly hadn't anticipated. A man across the room noticed me and immediately walked over with a warm smile. "Judge Whitmore," he said, shaking my hand firmly. "It's been years. I wasn't sure you'd be here tonight." We exchanged a few friendly words about the event and the organization hosting it. Then he introduced himself to my son and Emily with clear respect in his tone. After he walked away, Emily looked slightly surprised but didn't say anything yet. A few minutes later, another guest approached us, this time a woman who had worked in the federal court system many years earlier. She greeted me warmly and began reminiscing about a case we had both been involved in decades ago. Again, the tone was respectful, almost admiring. Emily listened quietly beside us, her eyes moving between the speakers as she tried to absorb what was happening. But the moment that truly caught her attention came about 15 minutes later. We were standing near one of the tables when a small group of people entered the room and began greeting various guests. One of them noticed me almost immediately and walked straight toward us with an expression of genuine surprise. "Arthur Whitmore," he said with a laugh. "I thought you had escaped these events after retirement." I recognized him instantly, a senior attorney who had argued several cases in my courtroom years earlier. We spoke for a moment, and during that conversation he casually said something that made Emily's eyes widen slightly. "Half the lawyers in this city still quote your rulings," he said. "You probably don't realize how many people learned from those decisions." The comment was said with the kind of respect that can't be manufactured. It was the respect professionals give someone whose work genuinely influenced them. And when he walked away, Emily turned to me with a thoughtful expression that reminded me of the quiet moment she had experienced at the wedding months earlier. Only this time there was no audience, no embarrassment, no tension. Just realization. "Arthur," she said quietly, "I didn't realize how many people knew you." I smiled gently. When someone spends enough years in a profession, they meet a lot of people along the way. But she shook her head slightly as if correcting my modest explanation. "It's more than that," she said. "They don't just know you, they respect you." I could see the understanding settling in behind her eyes now, The same understanding that had begun forming the night of the wedding but had not fully taken shape until this moment. Because for the first time she was seeing the part of my life that had never needed to be announced or defended. Reputation, when it's built slowly over decades, tends to reveal itself naturally when the right people walk into the room. Emily looked around the event hall again, noticing the quiet nods from a few other guests who recognized me. Then she gave a small thoughtful smile. "You really didn't say any of this about yourself at the wedding," she said. I chuckled softly. "People who spend their lives making decisions about others learn something important over time," I replied. "The loudest introduction is rarely the most impressive one." She nodded slowly, clearly appreciating that perspective in a way she hadn't before. And as the evening continued, I noticed something different in the way she introduced me to people who approached our table. Instead of the playful tone she once used at the wedding, she now spoke with quiet pride. "This is my father-in-law, Arthur," she would say. "He served as a federal judge for many years." There was no exaggeration in her voice, just respect. And as I watched her speak that way, I realized something that made the entire strange journey from the wedding reception to that charity dinner feel worthwhile. The lesson from that night had not only been understood, it had been accepted. But the most meaningful moment was still waiting ahead, because a few months later, during a family gathering where many of the same relatives from the wedding were present again, Emily did something no one expected. Something that quietly closed the story that had begun with humiliation and ended with something far more meaningful. Several months after the charity dinner, our families gathered again for another large event. This one wasn't nearly as formal as the wedding, but it still brought together many of the same relatives who had witnessed that unforgettable moment at the reception. It was a holiday celebration hosted by one of Emily's aunts, and the house was filled with the familiar energy of extended family, children running through the halls, adults sharing stories in small groups, and the kitchen overflowing with food the way family gatherings always seem to be. As I walked into the living room, I noticed something interesting almost immediately. A few of the relatives who had been present at the wedding glanced in my direction and smiled politely, as if remembering the strange evening we had all shared months earlier. But this time there was no awkwardness in those smiles. Instead there was something closer to warmth. The memory of the wedding had clearly settled into something more reflective over time. My son greeted several relatives while Emily moved through the room speaking with her family members. At first everything felt perfectly ordinary. People were laughing, exchanging updates about their lives, and enjoying the comfortable chaos that large families bring to gatherings like this. But about halfway through the evening, Emily did something that quietly changed the atmosphere in the room. Her aunt had asked her to say a few words before everyone sat down for dinner. Nothing formal, just a small thank you to the family for coming together during the holidays. Emily stepped toward the center of the room holding a glass, smiling as the conversations gradually softened around her. "I just wanted to say how grateful I am that our families have grown closer this year," she began. Her voice carried easily across the room, and the relatives who had been chatting nearby slowly turned their attention toward her. At first it sounded like a typical holiday message. She thanked her parents for organizing the gathering, mentioned how happy she and my son were in their first months of marriage, and joked lightly about how quickly life had changed since the wedding. But then she paused for a moment. And when she continued speaking, her tone shifted in a way that immediately caught everyone's attention. "There's also something I've been thinking about since the wedding," she said. "Now if you've ever been in a room where a past moment suddenly returns to the conversation, you know exactly what happens next. People grow quiet very quickly." A few relatives exchanged knowing glances, clearly remembering the same scene from the reception months earlier. Emily looked around the room, her expression calm but sincere. Then she said something that surprised nearly everyone listening. "At that wedding," she continued, "I made a mistake." The honesty of that statement settled over the room like a soft pause in the air. She wasn't embarrassed or defensive when she said it. She simply spoke the truth. "I thought I understood the people who were joining our family," she explained. "But the truth is, I had made assumptions about someone I barely knew." I noticed several relatives glance toward me at that moment, though Emily kept her eyes focused on the room as she spoke. "Arthur showed me something that night," she said. "Not by arguing and not by trying to prove anything, but by staying calm and respectful when it would have been easy to respond with anger." Her voice softened slightly as she continued. "That kind of patience taught me more about character than any speech could have." A few people nodded quietly, remembering exactly how that moment had unfolded. Then Emily turned toward me directly. The entire room followed her gaze. "Arthur," she said warmly, "I'm grateful to have you as part of this family. And I'm glad I've had the chance to get to know the person behind the reputation. There was a small ripple of laughter at that line, though this time it carried genuine affection rather than sarcasm. She lifted her glass slightly. To family, she finished. The room responded with raised glasses and quiet agreement, and just like that, the story that had begun with humiliation months earlier finally reached its conclusion. Later that evening, as conversations resumed and dinner was served, several relatives approached me with smiles and friendly greetings. But the moment that stayed with me most was when Emily sat down beside my son at the table and began laughing with her cousins, completely relaxed, as if the weight of that old misunderstanding had finally disappeared. Because families, much like courtrooms, eventually reach their conclusions. Evidence appears, perspectives change, and people grow. And when the truth becomes clear, the verdict tends to speak for itself. That night, the verdict in our family wasn't about who had been right or wrong at the wedding. It was something much simpler than that. The verdict was that respect, patience, and humility have a way of turning even the most uncomfortable moments into opportunities for understanding. And if you ask me, that's the kind of verdict every family should hope to reach in the end. Now, before I finish this story, let me share something I've learned after many decades of watching people, both inside courtrooms and inside families. Because if you've stayed with me through this entire story, you probably understand that what happened at that wedding wasn't really about a joke. It was about something far more common than people like to admit. Assumptions. You see, families are strange institutions. They bring together people who grew up in completely different worlds. Different habits, different expectations, different ideas about success and respect. And when those worlds collide, misunderstandings are almost guaranteed. Sometimes they're small. Sometimes they happen quietly. And sometimes, they happen in front of hundreds of guests at a wedding reception. What matters isn't the mistake itself. What matters is what people do after the mistake becomes clear. That night, my daughter-in-law believed she understood who I was. She thought she knew what kind of family her husband came from. In her mind, the story had already been written, and I was simply playing the role she had assigned to me. But life has a funny way of interrupting stories that are written too quickly. Because the truth about people rarely reveals itself through introductions or titles. It reveals itself through behavior, through patience, through the way someone carries themselves when they have every reason to react but choose not to. In my years as a judge, I watched thousands of arguments unfold in courtrooms. Lawyers would present evidence, witnesses would testify, and eventually the truth would emerge piece by piece. But families work differently. There's no bench, no formal testimony, no written rulings. In families, the verdict arrives slowly. Sometimes it takes a single moment for people to see something clearly. Sometimes it takes months, or even years. But eventually everyone learns who someone really is. And the interesting thing about that wedding is this. By the end of the night, no one was talking about the jokes anymore. They were talking about how the moment had been handled. They remembered the silence that followed the laughter. They remembered the realization spreading across the room. And most importantly, they remembered what happened afterward. The conversations, the apologies, the understanding that grew from a very uncomfortable moment. Today my daughter-in-law and I get along very well. In fact, she's one of the first people to laugh whenever someone in the family mentions that famous wedding story. Not because she's proud of what happened, but because she understands what it taught her. And truthfully, it taught the rest of the family something too. It reminded everyone that respect should never depend on what we think we know about someone. Because the quiet person in the room might have a story you've never heard. The person being underestimated might have spent a lifetime building a reputation you can't see yet. And sometimes the person being laughed at is simply waiting patiently for the moment when the truth speaks for itself. So if you ever find yourself in a room where someone is being judged a little too quickly, remember something an old judge has learned after many years of watching people. The loudest voices don't decide the final outcome. Time does. And when time delivers its decision, that's the real family verdict. Now I'm curious about something. If you had been sitting at that table during the wedding reception that night, when the jokes were being told and the room was full of laughter, what would you have done? Would you have joined the jokes? Or would you have waited to see the truth unfold? Think about that for a moment. Because in one way or another, every family eventually faces its own verdict.